Okay, so hello once again and welcome to Microeconomics, Econ 311. Right, so here we are continuing our discussion on application of consumer theory. So this is section 4, which as you can tell, we are building on the section. So if you don't understand anything, I would urge you to go back and review the previous sections. We are continuing our discussion on the application of consumer theory. So in this section, we'll discuss the income and substitution effects of a price change by highlighting differences in goods based on consumer response to quantity demanded out of income increase, right? And then we'll look at application of consumer theory in terms of equivalent variation and compensating variations. We'll discuss all these within this section. In terms of the content, that is the outline, I'm looking at income and substitution effects, application of this, application of utility maximization concept in labor supply, compensating variation, equivalent variation, and then I'll do a comparison of these in this section. In terms of the section outline at the end of the day, like I always say, I'll not belabor the points. They have been listed out here for you. You would have a very good understanding of what consumer theory is and how we apply them in terms of policy that are made daily. The section that you need to read in the textbook is chapter 15 of variant, which is intermediate micro. And if you are using Perloff, you are advised to read chapter 15 for this section. Really. So in terms of income and substitution effect, we know that when the price of a commodity changes, people change their behavior, right? And what is behind this change in behavior? The principle behind it are due to substitution and income effect, right? So with substitution effect, when a good becomes expensive, what do? You buy other products instead of that product, right? So that's a substitution effect. With income effect, when the price of a good increases, your real income falls. So what happens? You buy less of that good and less of all other commodities, right? So that is basically a decline. So here, as the price of A falls, real income rises, so the consumer will get to spend more on all other goods, including good A, right? So, in terms of the direction and size of the effect, we know that for normal goods, as the price falls, consumption rises, and as income rises, consumption rises. That is for normal goods. And for an inferior good, as the price falls, consumption rises. But as income rises, consumption falls. For a given good, on the other hand, as price falls, consumption falls, right? And as price rises, consumption falls. So know the difference. For inferior and normal goods, the substitution effect is always negative, right? Substitution effect is always negative. When it comes to given goods, they are peculiar goods that behaves differently. That when the good becomes cheaper, you even buy less of it, right? And when your income increases, you also buy less of it. So let's look at a scenario where we have other goods and good A, right? So you have your typical indifference curves and budget constraints, right? So we have budget constraints BC1, right? So we have BC1, the individual picks point A, which is a point of equilibrium, and consumes 1 unit of QA and some other units of the other goods. When there is a decrease in the price of good A, we know it rotates the budget line outwards so the consumer can buy more of good A. Let's look at the point of equilibrium that this consumer picks. This consumer picks point B by increasing consumption of what? QA, right? So here, a decrease in price has led to an increase in what? Quantity demanded. So this is the total effect of the price change. We move from point A to point B, but we have to decompose this effect into both substitution and income effect. So how do we get that? For substitution effect, what we do is that prices have changed, but we want to tax away the excess income that the individual is gaining as a result of the decrease in price, right? So we use the new relative price ratios, which is the new budget line, the slope of the new budget line. We draw that budget line, imaginary budget line, to the old indifference curve, and we see the points that this consumer will pick, and you see that the consumer picks point C, right, as the consumption, where the utility level is not changing. But with new prices, you see the consumer increases consumption of QA. So in effect, a movement from points A to B is your total effect, right? So 1 to 2 is your total effect. The substitution effect is a movement from A to C, which is 1 to 3. Right, the consumer is substituting along the indifference curve because good A has become cheaper. Then the income effect is a movement from where? C to B. Right, now they can buy more. So 3 to 2 is the income effect of the price change. So here we see that with an increase in income that is coming from a decrease in price, right, the consumer is increasing consumption, so it is negative, right? Check this. It is not an outright increase in income. The increase in income is originating from a decrease in price, and that is why we are saying it is negative over here. And with the substitution, a decrease in price leads to increase in quantity demanded, so it is also negative. The total effect of the price change is a movement from A to B, which is 1 to 2, right? And here we can tell that as price decreases, quantity consumed increases, and this is for a normal good. In another scenario, if we want to see how this consumer behaves, we'll see that we have a different set of budget constraints and indifference curves, right? So the consumer picks point A with the original price, the price of good A decreases, and they go to pick point B of the good. Let's look at substitution. With substitution, we are using the slope of what? The new budget line, which is the relative price ratios. The consumer picks point C, right, as a point of equilibrium. So we can tell that a movement from point A to point C is a substitution effect, right? 1 to 3, the consumer increases consumption of good QA. But let's look at the income effect. The income effect is a movement from point C to point B. So here you can tell that the consumer is decreasing consumption of QA because of an increase in income. And here we can tell that a decrease in price, which increases income, leads to a decrease in what? Consumption. So the movement is a positive one in terms of the income. Remember, the increase in income is originating from the price angle, and that is why we are saying it's positive over here. The total effect is a movement from where? Point A to B, right? But we have disaggregated that into substitution, which is A to C, and income, which is C to B, right? And this is for an inferior good, where you see the consumer reducing consumption when there is an increase in income due to a decrease in price. The other scenario is when we have a given good, and with the given good, like I indicated, even substitution effect is positive, right? So here you can tell that when there is a decrease in the price, original point is at point A, a decrease in price, we want to see how the consumer behaves. You see that with the substitution, the consumer moves from point 1 to point 3, right? A to C, that is a substitution effect. What is happening? A decrease in price is making the consumer do what? Increase the consumption of the good. Then when it comes to the income effect, the consumer moves from points C to B, right? So you see that the decrease in consumption is significant. So the substitution effect is less than the income effect. So the total effect is a reduction in consumption of the good, right? So in terms of summary, we can say that for a normal good, the total effect of a price change is negative because the negative income effect reinforces the negative substitution effect. For an inferior good, it is still negative, but the negative substitution effect is greater than the positive income effect. And for a given good, it is positive because substitution effect is less than the income effect at the end of the day. So closely related to this, we look at the labor leisure model. And here we assume that people use their time for two main things, which is to work or to leisure, right? Where work involves all activities that pay money and leisure are all non-work activities. So if the individual has 24 hours, it means that the number of hours of work, which is H, would be what? The 24 hours you have minus the number of hours you are not working, right? So based on this, people utility is maximized by consumption of goods that income gives you, Y. So the consumption of goods, and then non-work activities, which is leisure, right? The income you earn will be the wage rate multiplied by your hours of work, right? So if you earn some income that you don't work directly for, that will be our Y star. So when we look at this, we can tell that this individual, so one thing you need to notice that in this diagram, the first plane, once we are moving to the right on the x-axis, leisure increases. And from here, we see 24 hours in a day. When we are moving from this point 0 to the left towards the 0, hours of work increases. So at a wage rate W1, this individual picks point E1 and supplies 8 hours of work and leisure for 16 hours. When the wage rate increases, the individual increases hours of work by supplying 12 hours of work and leisuring for 12 hours. When we plot the wage against the leisure and the wage against the hours of work, this is what you have, and this is your typical upward sloping labor supply curve, right? So now we move on to the application of consumer theory, and here we are looking at compensating and equivalent variations. This enables us to measure how worse off an individual gets due to an increase in the price of the commodity, right? So for compensating variation, we measure the welfare loss to the consumer as a result of an increase in the price by estimating how much we need to compensate the consumer to restore him or her to the original level, right? And with equivalent variation, we are looking at the amount of money that we have to take away from the consumer to reduce his or her welfare, just like the price increase does to him or her, right? So in terms of compensating variation, it's positive when there is a price increase, right? So we give some money back to you to restore you to your original level. And then it is for compensating variation, it is negative when there is a price decrease. We take some money away from you to see how worse off you are, just like the price decrease, right? So in this scenario, we see that for compensating variation, what has happened? We have seen an increase in price. This is your original price. P1, equilibrium level was here, utility level was U1. Price increases and you see the consumer is worse off because the new equilibrium point is here. So with compensating variation, we see how much should we give to this individual to restore him back to the original level before the price increase. And this is how much we have to give this person. The gap between this is how much the quantum of money we have to give to this individual to restore him back to the original level before the price increase, right? So in terms of equivalent variation, it is positive when there is a decrease in price, right? So this is equivalent to compensating variation when there is an increase in price. So let's see. With equivalent variation, we see that an increase in price makes the consumer worse off, right? So we want to see how much money should we take away from the original budget of the consumer to make him equally worse off as the price increase. And that is a budget line which has the original slope of the original budget constraints, but tangent to the new indifference scale. So that gives us the quantum of money we have to take away from this consumer to make him worse off, just like the price increase has done, right? So that is equivalent variation. This is trying to explain what I have just discussed. So in terms of comparing equivalent variation and compensating variation, you see that for compensating variation, it is that, right? We compensate you for a price increase, and for equivalent variation, we take some money away from you to make you worse off, just like the price increase does to you. Right. So here, if we want to see a scenario where government, in an attempt to encourage agriculture, subsidizes agricultural inputs, right, by S, then it means that we want to see a scenario where government will subsidize agricultural inputs by a given amount, right? So the question is, how much should government subsidize farmers, right? So for compensating variation, we see that with the increase in price of inputs, right, we see, so for this, we are looking at a situation where P1 is less than P0. So here we see that there is what? An increase in the price of inputs, and the consumer is worse off. So the compensating variation is to give the consumer some money to take him back to the original level. And this is a situation of farmers, right? The question we are asking is, how much should we give to farmers? Okay, and from that you can tell that the consumer needs to be subsidized by this amount, the equivalent variation, this proportion. Right? This is how much the consumer needs to be subsidized. And here farmers have to receive this amount of subsidy. But as to how effective this policy would be, I would ask you to read further on agricultural subsidies, right? Agricultural subsidies. Okay, so we also move on to equilibrium of the consumer. And here with equilibrium of the consumer, we know that the consumer can have a surplus, where the surplus would be the amount you budgeted for to pay for the commodity and how much you actually paid for it, right? That is the difference. So in terms of the monetary measure that you get, when you are willing to pay more and you pay less, we say that there is a consumer surplus for this consumer. So in terms of subsidies, excise subsidies, we also know that it has an effect. So how should government go about application of subsidies? I have given a preamble here, and I would want you to go through it. I have provided a graph, right, that shows you how this is done with all the explanations given. So due to time, I will not go over all of it. And then I will move on lastly to the difference between compensated and ordinary demand curves. and we know that the compensated variation ensures the consumer remains on the same demand indifference curve. So that compensated indifference curve gives a steeper demand curve compared to the ordinary, because with the ordinary, which is the Marshallian demand curve, it includes both substitution and income effect. So in summary, we have discussed some applications of consumer theory in terms of looking at equivalent variation and compensating variations, and we have looked at how consumer is able to arrive at optimum bundles and all. I would ask you to graphically show the equivalent variation, right, the difference between equivalent variation and compensating variation using a price decrease, right? Using a price decrease, and discuss how compensating variation can be applied in a real world scenario. Good luck and all that.